This lecture will focus on kind of the rise of segregation and the legalization of it, and legalized discrimination in the South after Reconstruction. So African Americans were really struggling in the South after Reconstruction happened. Most people in the rural South, most people, but also especially most African Americans, were sharecroppers, farmers who just gave a big part of their crop as rent, and they usually were just constantly in debt. We talked about that debt spiral before in when we were talking about Reconstruction, and a bunch of them eventually left farming and went to the southern towns to find jobs, or they headed west to claim homesteads. And Benjamin Papp Singleton was a man who had an idea. He was convinced that no matter what, they wouldn't get a real chance to get ahead, a real chance to be better off in the South. And so he urged African Americans that wanted to farm and wanted to do these things to move west, and to move west specifically, he said, to Kansas. And he wanted them to move west to Kansas and create their own all African American communities. And about 6,000 of these people left their homes in something like an exodus. And the exodus is this story where the ancient Jews left Egypt to get away from the oppression that the Egyptians were performing on the Jewish people. And so that's kind of what they called themselves as, or, kind of like that. And so they called themselves the Exodusters. And the Exodusters left, and most of them arrived in Kansas in the spring of 1879 to set up their new communities. So all of these, the Exodusters left the South, but a lot of Southern farmers stayed. A lot of African American farmers in the South did stay, and they created something called the Colored Farmers National Alliance, which eventually got to a pretty big number. It numbered about 1.2 million members by 1890, and these members started to join the Populist Party, and the Democrats were very, very fearful of this because they thought, you know what, if the African Americans and the poor white farmers come together and they all vote, they would be unbeatable. There's no way that they could possibly win any more elections because none of those people would vote for the Democrats. And so the Democrats, to fight this, started to appeal to racism, and started to use all of these different methods to try and make it harder for African Americans to vote, and to try and split white voters and African American voters as much as possible. So basically, all they wanted to do was keep the African Americans from voting and keep the poor African Americans and poor whites of the South from bringing their power together and having that power. So some of these laws that were set up to take away the vote are outlined here. The 15th Amendment had said that you cannot take away any vote or the vote based on race. You can't take away anyone's right to vote based on race. But quickly the states found a loophole. They found out that if you made voting restrictions that indirectly targeted African Americans, that basically took away the vote from African Americans, and didn't allow them to functionally vote, but didn't specifically say that African Americans can't vote and that was the reason, then you could make these laws. And so states started to make these laws, and they were things like the poll tax. Okay, the poll tax is something that says if you want to register to vote, you have to pay a tax. This tax was too much for African Americans, but it also was too much for poor whites. And so they're quickly disenfranchising, taking away the vote from African Americans as well as these poor white people. A literacy test was another thing. The literacy test, you had to be able to read and understand the state constitution, and oftentimes they made this so confusing and difficult, the part of the state constitution that they asked, that no one could possibly pass it. And so that became this thing where they could cheat on it and say, oh, this white guy passed it, but the African American person was not able to pass it, and they didn't allow them to go through. And then, even though this was targeting the white people in the South too, a lot of states made laws around this. One of these laws was the grandfather clause, and the grandfather clause said that anyone who was able to, or anyone can vote and doesn't have to do any of these restrictions if they had an ancestor who could vote in 1867. So this was, before the 15th Amendment, 1867, and so nobody who was black could possibly get that exemption, whereas the white people all had that exemption. So it exempted almost all of the white voters and kept essentially these restrictions on the African American voters. And so legalized segregation started to happen. And segregation is separation of the races. So keeping the races, the black people and the white people, completely separate from each other if possible. And this happened through a set of laws, or a series of laws known as Jim Crow laws. And these Jim Crow laws enforced both discrimination and segregation in the South. Now, the Civil Rights Act of 1875, which had really was a pretty new law, it said you cannot keep people out of public places based on race. So you can't keep them out of anywhere that's public based on race. But the Supreme Court actually overturned it. They looked at it and they said, you know what? The 14th Amendment says that no state can keep people out of these areas, but that private companies are allowed to. And so if private organizations were allowed to, that means that hotels, theaters, railroads, they were free to practice segregation. They could have segregation happening in their companies. And so, with this, the companies in the southern states were emboldened by this idea and encouraged, and so they started to pass a bunch of laws that basically established legalized segregation in basically all public places. Southern whites and African Americans couldn't ride together in the same railroad cars, drinks from the same water fountains, sit in the same waiting rooms, okay, in a lot of these different places. And so, a court case came up of Plessy versus Ferguson. Homer Plessy, a black man, challenged a law that made him ride in a separate railroad car from white people, so riding in a colored-only railroad car. And the Supreme Court looked at it, and it got all the way to them, and they decided that that it was okay to have him ride in a separate railroad car, and they said that separate but equal facilities were okay. So these words came up: separate but equal is how segregation was supposed to work, but it's not how it did truly work. But it became this idea that allowed segregation and allowed this separation to happen. So we can see in this cartoon, it's supposed to be separate but equal, but what was really happening is you've got your car for white people, and then you have your Jim Crow car, your car for African Americans, separate but not equal, which took away from the intent of that law. Take a moment to write out your answer to checkpoint question number 1. So this time in history, in the last decade of the 1800s and the first decade of the 1900s, was kind of the low point in African American status in American history. And so while this was happening, there was lots of discrimination, lots of violence against African Americans in the country. And so some African American leaders started to fight back against it, and they did that in a number of different ways. And we're going to outline 4 of them here, but we'll start with these 2. The first is Ida B. Wells. She's this woman up on top. And Ida B. Wells fought against lynching, and lynching is executing someone by hanging them from the neck, usually without a legal trial. So a mob of people would get together and they would decide that this person needed to be executed, and they would do it. And about 154 African Americans were being lynched per year. So it was an incredible amount of people that were being essentially murdered by mobs of people. And she, Ida B. Wells, was an African American woman who fought back against this lynching, and she had these strong arguments against it. And she was from Tennessee, and eventually she got run out of her own town, and she decided to settle in Chicago, where she was able to write a book against lynching. And she demanded a trial law, saying that these people, all people, deserved a trial, and this lynching shouldn't be happening. And lynching did decrease in the 1900s, due in part to her actions and her fight against lynching. Another person who fought against lynching was Mary Church Tyrell. Mary Church Tyrell was a college-educated woman whose friend was lynched. Okay, so was killed, and when the president did essentially nothing about it and didn't punish the people that were doing this lynching, Mary Church Tyrell started her lifelong battle against a lot of different things, against lynching, against racism, against sexism. She helped out and helped find the association called the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, which is still around today, the NAACP. Which helps with African American rights. She formed a Woman Wage Earners Association, which helps African American women who were working. She led boycotts against stores in Washington, D.C. that wouldn't serve African Americans. She was part of women's suffrage associations. Basically, what her thoughts were that they didn't want any advantages because they were women or because they were African Americans or anything like that. They just wanted equal footing. They wanted an equal chance to accomplish different things. So she was working for the equal rights of African Americans and women to those of whites and men. Two other African American leaders at this time had ideas that were kind of opposite of each other. First off was Booker T. Washington, this man right here. He believed that African Americans should achieve their economic goals and not their political ones. So it's not important. It doesn't really matter that they don't have the power or that they don't have the equal rights and all that kind of stuff. They didn't need the civil rights. They didn't need social standing. They just needed economic opportunities. And so they needed to be able to work and, get themselves richer and get themselves to be better off economically, which would instantly bring them to be better off socially. And so he said, they basically thought that that was the answer. And said that in any time that he possibly could. So he said to prepare yourself with education and training rather than fighting for these civil rights. Become better rather than waiting for someone to treat you better and then becoming better. And W.B. Du Bois had an opposite opinion. He believed that there's basically no advantage to giving up civil rights, even temporarily, especially the right to vote, because that takes away any power that you could possibly gain. It doesn't matter how much money you have. If you have no power to vote or anything like that, there's no way that you can advance yourself as a person. And so, as we know, the fight to get back the vote and discrimination would be a long one. Parts of those discriminatory fights are still happening today. This fight against discrimination is still happening today. Take a moment to write out 3 questions that you have from the notes so far. If you have no questions, then create 3 test questions that you might see on a quiz or a test from this material.